Okay, so in the last um, lecture, we were talking about the move from an a priori argument, which was the ontological commitment argument, right here. We also looked at um, the principle of simplicity and how that leads us into the teleological argument as well as the cosmological argument. And that is the teleological argument was obviously the argument from design. And let me see if this audio should be fine. All right. Okay, so we looked at the principle of sufficient reason and the principle of simplicity. Now along with logic, um, that's a part of our toolkit that we'll be using in our journey ahead to figure out what's going on. And so yeah, so we were looking at um, we reached the point where the ontological commitment argument through a priori means, as well as the um, the teleological and the cosmological arguments from a posteriori, which were a posteriori arguments. All of them combined gave us reason to believe that a GCT or a GCB exists. And a part of the belief in a GCT was that it exists in the physical world, and so many of these religious um, religious uh, narratives claim that the GCT or the GCB, they know what the GCB wants, and they use the term God for that. And so from metaphysics, from philosophy, we're sort of now heading into religious studies. And we said that one of the defining properties or characteristics of a GCB was that they could only be one. And so we looked at the idea of polytheism, or there being many gods, and we felt that that didn't make sense um, to us. So for that reason, you could say that, and the reasons were, if there were two great beings, they none of them could be the greatest, right? Since there would be two, and they would have conflicts of, like, will, right? So if one wanted to move a chair 5 feet to the left and the other wanted to move a chair 5 feet to the right, there would be a stalemate. And then limitation on knowledge, so that each of them could keep secrets from the other one, so they would know everything else other than what the other great being was thinking. And that would be a limitation of knowledge that was logical, right? So we said it doesn't need to have, it shouldn't have illogical knowledge or illogical power, but everything that is logical, the greatest conceivable being should have access to uh, that knowledge. All right, so, and the last one was the principle of simplicity, so that if one great being gets the, or if one greatest being gets the job done, why do you need uh, more, especially if they are going to be these two problems, right? Okay, and so we sort of didn't go with polytheism, we're going to leave that behind. Now, even within monotheism, there's still quite a few narratives, right? And they're somewhat different, somewhat similar, but y- you can only believe one at one time, right? So how are you going to pick? How are you going to choose which one to believe? And now that we're here, should you even like trust what these guys are saying? And if you do trust them, on what basis? So on what basis would you reject or distrust one narrative, and on what basis would you accept uh, and some other narrative, some other tradition? Now, um, and remember, like throughout this whole journey, we've been trying to make the whole journey on our own. So all of this has been the whole journey from um, observing how experience works, how we make up concepts, um, how we can access abstract objects. All of that we could have done on anyone could have done on their own. Now, even up to the point where you can think about the GCB or discover the through abstract means what a GCB entails. You can do all of that on your own. Now, at this point where you're trying to figure out what the GCB wants you to do, or now that you have a belief in, or at least that's what your mind is telling, that you should have a belief in a GCB, now you don't have a choice. You can't access the GCB or its intentions directly. So at this point, you have the option of either listening or trying to listen to what these people have to say. So, and each of them says something different. So, on what basis would you choose one and reject another, or all of the others? Um, okay. And so the question then is, should you trust anyone else, right? We haven't asked this question yet because um, like up till now we were working off of ourselves. Now there's a problem here, right? We know that we exist, and so going off of that was easier. How do we figure out if how do we figure out on what basis we will judge the testimony of other people, and um, how do we figure out if they're telling the truth? And quite frankly, should you even listen to someone else? Are they even real? Do you know that they're real, or are they part of a, like we've discussed these skeptical scenarios before? So the matrix example, could these people be a part of the matrix and programmed? So obviously you aren't, because you can think independently, but you don't know anything about these people. So how do you figure out that other people are real? And that's a question that uh, sort of springs up if you don't have a choice. If you don't have a choice, and you the only way that you can access information regarding the GCB is through other people, we need to have a stance. We need to have a belief about other people, so that within the scope of that belief, we can figure out how much we can um, trust them, how what kind of things we're going to accept and what kind of things we're not going to accept, and what their importance is with respect to us, uh, or me as an individual. Okay, so let's look at that, right? Now we're going to mm, so an easy attempt, right, is that people say, okay, I act a certain way and other people act a certain way, and so therefore they must be real people. um, and that works through induction, right? So let's say whenever I've been picked by a thorn, I winced and I felt pain. So, and through induction I can say the next time I will be pricked by a thorn, I will wince and I will feel pain. Now that's something, um, also you can possibly put in perception slash memory here. I think I've done that with the next one. Anyways, um, so so what you're saying is there is some semblance of stability in how people, or at least how I react, right? And then there is a sense of harmony with respect to how other people react in a similar situation. So whenever John is pricked by a thorn, he has winced and said he felt pain. And so inductively, the next time John will be pricked by a thorn, he will wince and say he feels pain. Now, John seems to act the same way that I do when I'm pricked by a thorn. Does that does that let us know what is going on? So, uh, do we know now that John is a real person based off of his behavior? And here's the problem, sort of. And you can draw this as a parallel analogy to Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And the way you would do that is, so let's say you stub your toes or get a paper cut, and then you feel pain. That's an experience, right? And then you wince, and then you react, right? So input, process, output. Now, and um, so with John, what happens is you see the input, you see the output, you don't know what the experience was, right? So if John was a programmed robot, he could be programmed that whenever he it stubs its toes, it winces and cries out in pain, right? So you could have a robot, let's say, it's pretty straightforward enough to understand. So how, in games NPCs react, right? So in games there are people, and if you drive, so let's say GTA, if you hit someone with a car, they cry out in pain. um, but they obviously don't feel pain, right? So you're getting the input and the output. So you're missing an important part of the puzzle. So you know what happens with you, but you don't know what happens here. So you still don't know if uh, John is in pain or if John is real. And by being real, I don't mean physically real, I mean if there is a conscious being there, right? So beyond the just the physical, which is programmable, right? Beyond the physical, if there is an actual conscious being, self-aware being in there. Okay, um, so we don't have an epistemic justification for believing that John is in pain, at least not based on induction. And so so our senses, our experiences don't help us out. But what does help us out, in fact, here is, um, PSR and PS, right? So PSR sort of leads us to question that there has to be a sufficient explanation or a reason for John's wincing and saying that he is in pain, right? That's fair. But like we said, there could be many reasons for why. One of them could be that John is programmed for to wince and say that he is in pain, right? And that's where uh, if John is actually in pain, then that is a sufficient explanation for his behavior. uh, that's a sufficient explanation, and like we just mentioned, uh, the program, if he was programmed, that would also be a sufficient explanation for what we are seeing. But as we know, uh, if we stay in tune with our nature, um, what is the simplest explanation for his behavior, right? Quite possibly, as I know that my pain causes my behavior, it may well be the simplest to say that John's pain causes John's behavior, right? So we don't know for a fact that John is in pain, and that's why John is um, behaving the way that he's behaving. But we, but the simplest, and it's a sufficient explanation. The simplest as well is that he is in pain, and that's why he's reacting that way, right? So we can form a belief. We don't know, but we can form a belief that John is real based off of uh, how he operates in the world, and similarly, this works with everyone else. So you can form a belief about other minds, and that's the other mind's hypothesis, based off of PSR and PS, majorly PS. Okay, so here's a schematic of what's going on, right? First, you have to question if the mind tracks reality, right? So, are you seeing, if you're seeing John, is John physically there? Is there a physical body? If so, that's a, you could be saying that if I was in a matrix, my mind, so all of the sources of information, at least the perceptual sources of information, would be giving me unreal information, unreal knowledge, but it wouldn't be knowledge, unreal information about the world, right? But if my senses are actually tracking reality, then the best use of, oh, let me put all of this here. um Okay, so if the mind, and we don't know if the mind tracks reality, but if you have a, you're seeing things, the simplest reason is that they are there, and that's why you're seeing them. So PS again, but also trust, right? Um, you when you, let's say you're sitting on a chair and you get up and you start walking. You're not thinking, or you're not doubting the fact that ground will fall from beneath your feet, right? You have a belief, or you have a very strong inclination that things are stable and they're going to stay a certain way. So you have a default trust in how you act in the world. You act as if the world is real. So if you see a truck coming at you, you get out of the way, and so that's, you trust that that truck is real. You don't stand there to find out if it's real or not. And if you did stand there and find out, you wouldn't be able to do much with it. Anyways, so yeah, trust. So on the basis of trust, you're saying, okay, so whatever, most of what I'm seeing is probably real by default, and I'm acting off of that. And then based off of that information, the best use of the mind will either lead you to a belief in the OMH, which is justified, or a disbelief. And like we just said, based off of PS and PSR, the best use of our mind tells us that other people are real, right? At least that's a justified belief, based off of, well, that's the best that we can do. Okay, and this is pretty simple enough to understand. If you don't if you don't, and when we're saying best use of our mind, we're saying that we stay consistent with the tools that we use, right? So induction, logic, PS, PSR, all of that. We've been using that since the beginning. We're going to continue using that right now. We're not changing our tools. Um, we're not ignoring them. So if PSR mm, leads us to ask a question about something or ask for a sufficient reason for something, we stay consistent and we try to answer the question. We try to look for an answer. We try to look for a sufficient explanation. We don't, ignore PSR. We don't get to pick and choose. If we're going to use our tools, we're going to use them throughout. Okay. So now that we have a belief in other people and the fact that other people are real, um, you can pretty much have a moral framework now, um, such that if other people are real, and remember, you have, before you formed this belief, you had also formed a justified belief that a GCB is real, and now you have a belief that other people are real. And so, in that context, if the GCB is real and he has created other people who are real, um, this is the moral framework that is then uh, that then makes sense for us, right? So morality is constituted of internal motivations and behavioral norms that are considerate of other conscious beings. It was important that we figure out if other beings are conscious, right? And the OMH helps us get there. Okay, so now I have reason to believe that other people are real, right? Now what? How do we know who is telling the truth about the GCB? Right, so back to the earlier question, we have a reason to believe that other people are real. We still don't know if they're telling the truth. How do we figure out who's telling the truth? And how do we figure out who we will believe? So the answer to that is pretty simple, right? Like we've said up till now, we can evaluate which version of the God aligned with a philosophical framework for the GCB. Now, we already have a philosophical framework for the GCB. Remember, we said that we were trying to conceive of a greatest conceivable being. So, when each of these people, we're not going to trust them blindly. We can only trust our senses to an extent. Trusting other people, we will need to have a bias first, and that bias is, well, not exactly a bias but like a preconceived notion, you could say, of what we're trying to look for, and based on that we can compare other people's testimony, and we will stay consistent with our tools. So the ontological commitment argument, so any, let's say, narrative that is illogical, we won't accept it, right? And we will not. So if something, if there's a sort of a weird narrative, you're going to ask why it's weird. Like, we're not going to just let things go. We're going to ask for a sufficient reason for things, and uh, we're going to lean towards simpler explanations, simpler narratives, as long as they're sufficient, obviously, in explaining what's going on. And we're going to stick to our conception of a GCB, and as long as that aligns with the narrative of God, um, that's what we're going to go with. So that's pretty much it for today, I think. Right, I should stop recording.